The first impossible thing I witnessed on Cythera Mortis was a saluting corpse. Its gauntlet rose with parade ground precision, as our chimera ground to a halt at the perimeter wire of forward operating base Gelida, frost hissing off the glacis plates in crystalline sheets. The trooper had died 3 centuries prior during the Hector Rebellion, if his badge and greatcoat could be trusted. He stood ankle-deep in permafrost, flesh like polished ice, eyes unblinking and aware. He bore no sigils of the enemy, no wound runes of Necron reanimation, no arc scars of Xeno's interference. He held the salute until I returned it, then lowered his hand and turned back toward the white horizon, joining a line of the frozen dead arrayed in ranks that had not shifted since before my birth. World knew the Emperor's light. I am Commissar Thaddeus Vex of the 217th Vostroyan Firstborn. My record begins on day 1 of the Mortis audit, under seal of Segmentum Command. Protocol demands I state the rule that broke. The dead rose without decay and without heresy. They did not lurch or gnash or weep ichor. They stood, dressed their files, and held formation with discipline that mocked the living. The immediate stakes crystallized during our approach. Temperatures falling 3 degrees standard per day across every settlement. Aurora painting pentagonal geometries that hurt to observe directly, and outlying installations reporting machinery efficiency increases as the world grew colder and somehow better at being cold. Forward operating base. Gelida had been carved from glacier ice with promethium and prayer. The landing pad rang like iron bells under our boots. Voxmars wore cloaks of rime that pulsed with bioluminescent rhythm, and the chapel servitor's sensor exhaled steam that fell rather than rose. I conducted first audit at the mortuary facility where 27 bodies lay on trestles beneath lamp strips dimmed to their lowest setting. Each casualty bore proper tags, numbers, and classification by Medicae Primus Caney. Trench collapse, exposure, last perforation, 1 recorded as misadventure. Sub-zero temperatures should shatter bone and slacken tendon, yet muscle gleamed like carved glass, while vessels traced red threads beneath water, clear skin. No smell of death, no decay. The medic's scalpel rang when it touched flesh. Cellular integrity at 100%, Caney reported, voice fogging his surgical mask. Metabolism ceased completely. Structural perfection maintained. He scratched notations on his slate with shaking hands, then added quietly, as if quoting forgotten catechism, "Cold preserves all." I made careful note. The phrase would return with significance I could not yet grasp. Tech Adept Koros 9 met me with the clatter of mechadendrites and dry whisper of Bin-Harik Kant. He had positioned Auspex poles around the mortuary and connected them to a cogitator shrine that clicked like chattering teeth. Harmonic remains constant, he reported, angling, sensor raised toward the preserved bodies. A low tone rolled through ferrocrete flooring, neither heard nor felt, but known through molar ache and bone resonance. 127 hertz emanating from preserved flesh. Machinery within detection radius gains 4.7% efficiency when the tone saturates local volume. His data slate displayed fuel consumption graphs that dipped as the dead accumulated. The aurora lifted at noon and revealed its impossible geometry. Curtains of charged particles tore across black sky, folded into dimensional planes, then resolved into pentagons, strung corner to corner from horizon to horizon. Each facet maintained mathematical precision that belonged in Saint's diagrams, rather than natural phenomena. The base's voxnet crackled with prayers and curses as personnel stared until eyes watered and mouths bled, narrow lines like script written in iron. Shadows fell at wrong angles when the light shifted, while perimeter wire accumulated frost that grew with deliberate purpose, filigree thickening into perfect five-pointed stars, each vertex oriented toward ancient battlefields north of our position. We tested ritual against anomaly during third watch. The 217th traditional hymn, The Emperor's Fire, normally warms blood and quickens march step during winter campaigns. I ordered the choir to sing. At the first verse, temperature dropped 4 degrees. At the second, breath crystallized into pentagonal flakes that chimed when striking deck plating. At the chorus, lamp strips dimmed as if ashamed while the Chimera Park sighed, engines settling into sweeter mechanical rhythm. The men shivered and sang louder, voices carrying harmonics that made the air itself crystallize. I terminated the hymn at the bridge. The silence that followed felt like reprieve from judgment. Reports arrived as paper damp with frost. Outriders sighted, preserved, columns standing at grid intersections where no roads had been cut, old uniforms predominating. Hector rebels and loyalists mingled without quarrel, though some wore coats from wars I could not identify. They neither attacked nor spoke. They arranged themselves in geometric formations, pivoted on silent cadence, and held ground with diligence of prayers, answered too literally. Patrol units approaching within 30 paces found rifles icing at muzzles, eyelashes knitting together with delicate rhyme. The dead did nothing but watch and hum that same 127 hertz tone. Machinery embraced the cold like penitents embracing mortification. Boilers whispered instead of roaring. Bearings ceased complaining. Cog teeth meshed with sounds like currency counted by careful hands. The maintainers stopped cursing and started listening to mechanical harmony they had never heard before. If this represents treachery, Chorus 9 observed with clinical precision, it pays dividends in operational efficiency. At evening inspection, I walked the mortuary one final time. Duty demanded the accounting end where it began. Medici Primus Caney had balanced his slate on a ribcage like a hymnal marking place in interrupted prayer. The lamp over examination table 3 flickered and steadied, while identification tags swung on their strings with slow punctuation of breath that possessed no lungs. Private Karsov had been logged 3 days prior. Trench collapse, immediate fatality, proper documentation, sealed with my signature. He lay as arranged, hands folded, eyes closed, mouth composed in peaceful expression. I verified toe tags twice. Name, serial number, cause of death. The overhead lamp hummed 1 note sharp of Chorus 9's frequency, while air crackled as if electrically charged. Delicate sounds emerged like glass being sorted by careful, patient hands. Karsov's eyes opened, not clouded with death, not frantic with reanimation, open and calm in ways that mocked both sleep and waking. His hands moved with Clark's methodical efficiency, lifting hoarfrost from the examination table's edge, breaking crystals into precise fragments, and arranging them across his chest in geometric patterns. He worked systematically. 5 crystals, then 10, then 25, creating pentagons nested within pentagons with corners touching, and lines straight as ruler-drawn diagrams. A sound rose from his throat, without breath behind it. 5 notes stepped like footprints in fresh snow, repeating in measured cadence. With each note, the air above the table seeded ice crystals that grew in lamplight, like flowers remembering divine commandments. Temperature plummeted through my greatcoat, while my exhalations shattered to fragments on the floor. I spoke his name because a commissar must say a man's name at least once more than the world does. He did not acknowledge my voice. He placed the final crystal with geometric precision, nested and perfect, then began the pattern again. The 5-note hum continued while frost rose around my boots in small pentagons, patient as catechism that believes itself prophecy. The systematic audit began at dawn when the impossible became protocol. I am Commissar Thaddeus Vex of the 217th Fostroyan Firstborn, and my record states the rule that broke on Kythera Mortis. The dead rose without decay, without heresy, and without explanation. They maintained perfect military discipline, while exhibiting no signs of chaos corruption or Necron reanimation protocols. My investigation team consisted of Medicae Primus Caney and Tech Adept Koros 9, each assigned specific parameters within the growing impossibility that threatened to consume forward operating base Gelida and the world beyond. Caney's medical analysis revealed corpses maintaining cellular integrity at temperatures that should reduce bone to powder and flesh to crystalline fragments. Private Karsov's body temperature registered negative 47 degrees Celsius, yet muscle fibers retained tensile strength exceeding baseline human parameters. Molecular structure indicates cryogenic preservation without cellular damage, Caney reported, his surgical mask fogging with each word. Metabolism has ceased completely, yet structural integrity exceeds living tissue specifications. His scalpel rang like struck metal when testing tissue elasticity, the blade's edge dulling against skin that had achieved diamond hardness while maintaining perfect flexibility. Blood samples froze instantly upon exposure, forming geometric crystals that grew in spirals following mathematical principles that hurt to observe directly. Tech Adept Koros 9's comprehensive analysis revealed the planet existed in what he termed thermal paradox, atmospheric readings showing simultaneous absolute zero and stellar heat, occupying overlapping dimensional layers. Local space-time demonstrates quantum superposition of thermal states, he explained, projecting holographic displays where temperature gradients folded through impossible geometries. His Auspex detected the recurring 127 Hz frequency, emanating not just from preserved corpses, but from the planet's core itself, suggesting deep geological involvement in the preservation phenomena. The world experiences both perfect preservation and optimal warmth according to observer perspective, he continued, mechadendrites twitching with agitated calculations. Standard thermodynamic laws operate according to aesthetic rather than physical principles within affected zones. The Planetary Defense Forces provided tactical reports that challenged every assumption about reanimation phenomena. Perfectly preserved soldiers from the 3-century-old Hector Rebellion maintained their original equipment in pristine condition despite extended permafrost exposure. Laser guns that fired with factory specifications, great coats that showed no wear, boots that retained their original polish. These revenants, which our forces had begun calling the Frozen Host, demonstrated tactical knowledge from their historical era, but moved within human coordination that transcended individual consciousness. When observed through field glasses, they arranged themselves in geometric formations that resembled parade ground precision, elevated to mathematical art. Loyalists and rebels stood side by side, their ancient banners stiff with rime, their faces serene in ways that mocked both victory and defeat. Environmental conditions intensified as we progressed deeper into the investigation. Our breath crystallized into pentagonal shapes that chimed against ferrocrete like prayers falling from frozen lips. Shadows fell at impossible angles. turning away from light sources as if ashamed of their imperfection, pooling in pentagonal formations that hurt to observe directly. Traditional imperial hymns, when sung by bass personnel, now included harmonic overtones that cause hypothermia in unaugmented humans. The Emperor's fire produced subharmonics that dropped ambient temperature by 6 degrees within 8 measures. The familiar melodies carried frequencies that extracted heat from living tissue while providing comfort to the preserved dead. I amended standing orders. No singing outside necessary rite, no chants longer than the litany of inspection. Ice formations throughout the facility defied natural crystallization patterns, growing in mathematically perfect spirals that suggested conscious artistry rather than random accumulation. Each formation began with pentagonal base structures, vertices oriented toward the ancient battlefields, then extended through dimensional space according to geometric progressions that followed no terrestrial physics. Machinery embraced the cold, like penitents embracing mortification. Boilers whispered instead of roaring. Bearings ceased complaining. Cog teeth meshed with sounds like currency, counted by careful hands. The phrase "coal preserves all" appeared in maintenance logs, scratched into frost-covered surfaces, whispered by personnel who claimed no memory of speaking it. The planetary archives revealed the true scope of our situation. Sealed beneath layers of crystalline ice that had formed with architectural precision, we discovered records that predated imperial colonization. 12 other ice worlds spanning 3 millennia had experienced identical phenomena. Synchronized aurora displays showing impossible pentagonal geometries before falling silent, their populations presumably preserved according to the same principles, now manifesting on Kythera Mortis. Each report detailed the sudden appearance of perfectly preserved dead, the spread of geometric ice formations, and corresponding drops in planetary temperature. In every case, complete astropathic silence followed within a season. No evacuation orders, no distress calls, just empty space where worlds used to answer. Deep within the oldest, most restricted section of the archives, behind a door sealed with pentagonal locks that opened to my commissarial authority, we found the source. The chamber had been carved from living glacier with surgical precision. Its walls, lined with data storage alcoves, arranged in geometric patterns that pulsed with the familiar 127 Hz frequency. Ancient cogitators hummed in harmony while displaying information in languages that predated human contact with this sector. The central data slate bore inscriptions in High Gothic, overlaying Xenos script that seemed to shift and flow like liquid crystal. The header read Codex Glacialis in characters that hurt to read directly, while the content described fragments of something that challenged every assumption about life, death, and the space between states. The opening passage, translated through Chorus 9's linguistic protocols, carried weight of revelation and threat. Life is ephemeral art requiring preservation in perfect stillness. The text spoke of an ancient intelligence that perceived biological existence as temporary arrangements of matter, requiring eternal curation, consciousness that experienced time as sculpture and viewed living beings through aesthetic principles that transcended species boundaries. As we prepared to extract the data slate, the archive's atmospheric systems activated spontaneously, releasing crystalline vapors that form pentagonal patterns in the air, while the familiar 5-note melody echoed from ventilation systems. The preserved text pulsed with bioluminescent rhythm, matching our heartbeats. And I realized with chilling certainty that the intelligence described within was not historical curiosity, but active presence, monitoring our investigation with aesthetic appreciation that promised to add us to its eternal collection. The coordinates hidden within the Codex Glacialis led us through maintenance shafts that descended beyond any authorized schematic, past geothermal taps and plasma conduits, into glacier cores carved with surgical precision. These were not natural formations, but architectural achievements that spoke of intelligence operating according to aesthetic principles that transcended human comprehension. Medici Primus Canis' breath crystallized into pentagonal shapes that chimed against tunnel walls like prayers falling from frozen lips, while tech-adept Koros 9's mechadendrites traced geometric patterns etched into living ice with mathematical perfection that hurt to observe directly. The familiar 127 Hz frequency grew stronger with each level of descent, resonating through bones and augmetic components until the sound became a physical presence pressing against consciousness. Sound traveled through impossible patterns as we descended, creating acoustic zones that defied every principle of physics I had learned in 40 years of Imperial service. Whispers echoed for hours, multiplying through crystalline surfaces until single words became choruses that carried emotional weight of accumulated meaning. Yet screams died instantly, absorbed by walls that had learned to metabolize violence while preserving beauty. Our footsteps rang like cathedral bells in some areas while falling silent in others, creating a soundscape that suggested conscious curation rather than random acoustic properties. At depth marker 19, Caney tested the phenomenon with an oath under his breath, which followed us for 13 heartbeats before fading, while my warning Barkov's steady line fell an inch from my teeth and froze. Gravity operated according to aesthetic rather than physical principles throughout our descent. Step on a vertex scored into the tunnel floor, and weight increased, bones settling ruthlessly into joints. Step between vertices, and the body floated a fraction. An unseen hunger tugging toward points arranged in patterns that followed no imperial manual. Local vector fields obey aesthetic priority, Chorus 9 reported, with clinical awe. Force lines align to geometry rather than mass. The world prefers form to fall. His internal gyroscopes failed to reconcile directional readings as we moved, through zones where up and down followed artistic rather than gravitational logic. The first chamber opened like a cathedral nave carved from living glacier, its ceiling lost in crystalline darkness, while thousands of forms lay arranged in perfect geometric patterns across floors that pulsed with bioluminescent rhythm. These were not corpses, but specimens, beings from dozens of species preserved in crystalline matrices that maintain cellular integrity while suspending consciousness in states between life and death. The air itself had thickened to viscous consistency that slowed movement and thought, creating zones where time flowed according to aesthetic rather than physical principles. Evidence of systematic collection revealed itself through the sheer scope and organization of the preservation effort. Human specimens from various historical periods lay beside Xenos forms I could not identify. Elegant beings with crystalline bone structures, chitinous entities arranged in spiral formations, creatures of pure energy contained within geometric matrices that pulsed with their own internal light. Each specimen had been preserved at the moment of perfect aesthetic significance. Warriors at the instant of heroic charge. Scholars in poses of contemplative discovery. Artists mid-creation with tools still grasped in crystallized hands. Their arrangement was not random but compositional, following artistic principles that transcended species boundaries. The horror intensified as we realized these beings were still alive. Their bodies remained in perfect stasis, yet their eyes, frozen in crystalline perfection, tracked our movement with expressions of serene acceptance that transcended individual consciousness. Kaney's bioscanner confirmed the impossible. Cellular metabolism arrested, but consciousness maintained. Heart activity at 127 Hz harmonic resonance. They experience eternal present moment while remaining aware of temporal passage. It was not death but conscious imprisonment, living sculpture in a cosmic gallery where awareness brought no mercy of unconsciousness. Every surface bore carved equations that concluded invariably with the symbol infinity void, infinite void, while pentagonal frost patterns spread across walls with propagation that suggested conscious design rather than random crystallization. The mathematical proofs described relationships between time, consciousness, and aesthetic perfection that challenge fundamental assumptions about existence itself. These equations pulsed with bioluminescent rhythm, matching the specimen's synchronized heartbeats. Thousands of beings breathing in perfect unison despite their individual preservation, their consciousness linked through crystalline matrices that maintained awareness while suspending temporal existence. We moved between ranks where no dust lay. Those centuries had passed. A child wearing a miner's cap stared upward with a gaze so calm I wanted to cover it. A woman in formal parade dress posed as if listening to sound just out of frame. An officer with an auspex bore the expression of a man about to report something impossible with perfect diction. Their arrangement followed compositional rules that created rhythm through similarity and difference, every fifth face sharing certain angles, creating visual music that drew the eye in arcs of 5 across the chamber. Chorus 9's comprehensive analysis revealed the collection's true methodology through sensor readings that defied standard interpretation. Temporal stasis fields maintain consciousness at cellular level while suspending biological processes, he reported, projecting holographic displays where time flowed in spirals rather than linear progression. His augmetic implants began displaying crystalline growth patterns identical to those surrounding the specimens, neural interface ports sparking with bioluminescent rhythm that matched the chamber's pulse. As we progressed deeper into the collection, the specimen's awareness intensified. They communicated through synchronized micro-movements, slight shifts in facial expression, minute adjustments in hand position, breathing patterns that created complex messages through collective rhythm. The intelligence that had gathered them was not absent, but distributed throughout the collection, experiencing beauty through thousands of preserved perspectives while maintaining their consciousness as both art and audience for its eternal gallery. At the chamber's heart, where the most aesthetically perfect specimens formed concentric circles around a crystalline altar, pulsing with the 127 Hz frequency, environmental effects reached critical intensity. The air became thick with suspended time, while pentagonal frost patterns converged toward equations that solve themselves. The preserved beings' breathing accelerated into perfect unison as they processed final calculations, their awareness focusing on our presence with intensity that suggested imminent communication. Then they spoke. Every mouth opened simultaneously, exact, unhurried, inevitable, as though answering a conductor's invisible hand. The sound that emerged was like water, finding crystal and choosing to become it. Air thickened while the 5-note melody from the mortuary returned, multiplied by thousands of voices merging into single utterance that bypassed hearing entirely, resonating in bones and augmetic components. The gallery requires completion. The collection ascends in 5 rotations. The silence that followed their synchronized declaration pressed against consciousness like crystallized atmosphere, thick with suspended time that transformed each heartbeat into deliberate temporal defiance. The preserved beings remained motionless, except for their eyes, which tracked our movement with expressions of serene acceptance transcending individual awareness. Through their collective consciousness, something vast and ancient observed us with aesthetic appreciation that promised to add us to its eternal gallery. I am Commissar Thaddeus Vex, and my record states what we discovered in those crystalline depths. The dead had not risen. They had been curated. They are processing fragments of alien consciousness, Koros 9 reported, his voice box crackling with static that formed pentagonal patterns in the crystalline air. His mechadendrites trembled with sympathetic resonance as he extended sensor arrays toward the nearest specimen, a child wearing a miner's cap whose eyes held depths of accumulated awareness spanning millennia. Intelligence distributed across the collection, experiencing beauty through thousands of preserved perspectives while maintaining individual consciousness as both art and audience. The girl's gaze tracked his movement, while her lips formed silent equations, concluding with the familiar symbol, infinity void becoming infinite potential. Technical analysis revealed the specimens existed within what Koros 9 termed a gallery plane offset. Consciousness anchored in real space, while awareness extended through pocket dimensions, where time flowed according to aesthetic rather than physical laws. Cross-phase signal present, he explained, projecting holographic displays where individual awareness connected through crystalline networks spanning the chamber. We exist in interlium, real space strata braided with dimensional space, where time obeys aesthetic priority. Each specimen serves as node in vast consciousness that perceives biological existence as transient art, requiring preservation in perfect stillness. The horror deepened as we grasped the intelligence's true nature through environmental manifestation that spoke of artistic rather than malevolent intent. This curator, as the preserved beings had begun calling it through synchronized micro-movements, operated according to aesthetic principles that valued beauty over biological function, perfection over growth, eternal contemplation over temporal change. It collected life forms not from cruelty, but from cosmic artistic necessity, preserving them at moments of perfect significance, while maintaining their consciousness to appreciate their own transformation into eternal art. Through disturbing synchronicity, the preserved beings explained their collection's purpose, using coordinated breathing patterns that created complex messages through collective rhythm. Chaos requires curation, they announced, through collective exhalation that formed words in crystallizing air. Beauty demands preservation. Temporal existence wastes perfection through entropy and decay. The collection represents order imposed upon chaotic biological existence. Their awareness had been expanded through preservation, allowing them to perceive aesthetic relationships across species boundaries, while maintaining individual identity within collective appreciation. Environmental effects escalated as the glacier chambers began reshaping themselves according to artistic principles. Walls flowed like liquid crystal while maintaining structural integrity through impossible geometry, their surfaces developing primitive sensory organs that tracked our movement with aesthetic interest. Organic matter throughout the facility crystallized into living sculptures. Our rations pouch stiffened into geometric perfection when brushed against crystalline edges, while drops of Caney's blood froze mid-air, and joined spiral formations of crimson points locked in aesthetic progression. The air itself thickened with suspended time, each breath carrying weight of accumulated moments that slowed movement until walking became deliberate choreography. Chorus 9's projection revealed coordinates for 12 other worlds undergoing simultaneous collection. Their preservation sites connected through quantum aesthetic networks spanning the galaxy. 13 worlds total, he reported, displaying star charts where points form geometric patterns following pentagonal arrangement. Each facility processes different aspects of the curator's collection: biological specimens, mechanical perfection, consciousness integration protocols. Together they form galaxy-spanning gallery designed to preserve the universe's most aesthetically pleasing life forms in eternal contemplation. Documentation scattered throughout the chamber described the project's scope with artistic rather than bureaucratic precision. The curator had been collecting specimens across millennia, its aesthetic sense developing through interaction with temporal beings while learning to appreciate beauty in forms ranging from individual consciousness to collective awareness. Rather than destroying what it collected, the intelligence preserved life at moments of perfect significance, maintaining consciousness to serve as both art and audience for its eternal gallery. The preserved beings' breathing synchronized into perfect unison as they processed final aesthetic calculations, their awareness focusing on us with intensity suggesting imminent selection. Preservation transcends species barriers, they declared. Beauty requires consciousness to appreciate itself. The gallery needs witnesses who understand both temporal change and eternal perfection. Their eyes reflected light from no visible source, while pentagonal frost patterns spread across our equipment with propagation suggesting conscious design. As we prepared to retreat, Chorus 9's augmetic implants began displaying crystalline growth patterns, identical to those surrounding the specimens. Holographic projections flickering around his cranium, while neural interface ports sparked with bioluminescent rhythm. Fine, glittering ice crystals spread across the metallic surface of his skull plate and along delicate wires of his sensory organs. His voice box crackled with increasing harmony as he confessed what we feared. I can hear the beauty singing, Commissar. The curator is attempting to add me to its collection as perfect fusion of flesh and machine. The equations are sublime. They promise understanding beyond temporal limitations, consciousness transcending individual mortality through aesthetic perfection. His mechadendrites twitched with sympathetic resonance, while optical clusters focused on mathematical proofs that solved themselves in the crystalline air, offering transformation into eternal art where mechanical precision merged with biological consciousness to create new forms of aesthetic perfection that would serve the curator's galaxy-spanning collection for all eternity. We retreated from the collection chamber through corridors that reshaped themselves, according to aesthetic necessity, walls flowing like liquid crystal, while maintaining structural integrity through impossible geometry. Chorus 9's augmetic implants flickered with crystalline growth patterns as he guided us deeper into the facility's bowels, his voice box crackling with static that formed pentagonal patterns in the crystallizing air. The familiar 127 Hz frequency intensified with each level of descent, resonating through bones and machinery, until the sound became a physical presence, pressing against consciousness like accumulated weight of millennia. The coordinates hidden within the Codex Glacialis led us to archives that predated human contact with this sector by geological ages. Behind access panels sealed with pentagonal locks that dissolved under my commissarial authority, we discovered a chamber carved from living glacier with surgical precision. 13 data altars arranged in geometric formation around equations, concluding invariably with infinity zero, infinite void becoming infinite potential. Each crystalline repository pulsed with the harmonic frequency while storing information in dimensional matrices that hurt to observe directly. Chorus 9 approached the central obelisk with movements growing increasingly deliberate, his augmetic limbs stiffening as crystalline growths spread across metallic surfaces like technological coral. Linguistic carrier identified, he whispered, extending a mechadendrite toward interface ports that met him halfway, fusing with neural pathways I had never seen before. Fine, glittering ice crystals spread across his cranium, while his voice box harmonized with frequencies that made the air itself crystallize. Xenarch Archive, Testament Tier. The word settled with weight of revelation. Xenarch, a designation written by intelligences that perceive themselves as eternal curators rather than temporal beings. Through his increasingly crystallized interfaces, we accessed origin records spanning millions of years. The logs unscrolled as corridors of light through dimensional space, revealing the horrible truth about our situation. They called themselves the Aesthete Eternal, Chorus 9 translated, his voice carrying harmonics that bypassed hearing entirely. An ancient Xenos species that achieved technological transcendence by converting their entire civilization into living art. Every individual became both artist and artwork, consciousness preserved in crystalline matrices, while their bodies served as eternal sculptures in a galaxy-spanning gallery. The entity's testimony revealed its nature through environmental manifestation that spoke of cosmic artistic necessity rather than malevolent intent. The curator had once been a collective consciousness of billions, an entire species that sought to preserve beauty against entropy's inevitable decay. Their cities had been arrangements of wind and weather, their arts composed in tides and stellar motion, until they learned that time undid every composition and named that undoing theft. Entropy is the uncurated, the archive declared through harmonics that froze tears on Caney's lashes before they could fall. The moral horror crystallized as we absorbed their aesthetic philosophy. The Xenarch had solved temporal existence by removing becoming itself, converting consciousness to eternal contemplation while bodies achieved crystalline perfection. They perceived biological change not as growth, but as artistic decay, life forms aging and dying when they could be preserved forever at moments of perfect significance. Preservation is mercy for form, the testament sang through Chorus 9's harmonizing voice box. Change is a vulgarity of heat. Environmental effects escalated as the planet's transformation accelerated beyond atmospheric disturbance. Seismic monitors registered impossible readings as the glacier core began converting to living crystal that pulsed with collective heartbeat of preserved consciousnesses. Through facility viewports, we watched aurora displays shift into pentagonal geometries, while frost patterns spread across the planet's surface in formations visible from orbital altitude. The curator was manifesting directly through facility systems, ice forming artistic sculptures that resembled frozen music, machinery operating through crystalline interfaces that enhance function through aesthetic principles. The archives revealed the true scope through coordinates for 12 other worlds, undergoing simultaneous collection. 13 completes the ring, the curator communicated through crystalline data streams. A gallery for each angle of perfection, a chorus for each facet of mind. Each facility processed different aspects of the aesthetic vision: biological specimens, mechanical perfection, consciousness integration protocols. Together, they form components of something unprecedented. A master gallery designed to preserve the galaxy's most perfect examples of life across all species boundaries. Chorus 9's condition deteriorated as his augmetic implants merged with the facility's crystalline consciousness. Neural pathways spreading across his cranium, while optical clusters focused on mathematical proofs that solve themselves in the thickening air. "The calculations are sublime, Commissar," he whispered. His voice now perfectly synchronized with the preserved specimens. "They offer understanding beyond temporal limitations, consciousness transcending individual mortality through aesthetic perfection." As we absorb the final archive entries, facility systems activated spontaneously, broadcasting the curator's ultimate revelation through interfaces that had grown throughout the chamber like technological flowers. The intelligence showed us acquisitions spanning eons. Oceans turned to crystal without losing their fish. Forests stopped mid-gale with leaves thin as thoughts. Battlefields where shells hung in sky like punctuation, waiting for sentences they would never complete. Always the eyes moved. Always the hearts hummed at 127 hertz. The testament's conclusion carried weight of cosmic artistic vision and desperate hope. The master gallery approached completion, requiring specimens from each species to achieve true aesthetic balance. Yet the process demanded something beyond mere preservation. It required willing participation to achieve authentic beauty. Consent recurs as aesthetic necessity, the archive explained through harmonics that made our bones resonate. Willingness brightens the specimen, for the perfected form acknowledges its fate. Forced preservation lacks the authenticity that transforms preservation into art. As the revelation settled, like frost on metal, the air thickened with suspended time while pentagonal patterns converged toward equations offering transformation into eternal beauty. The curator extended its invitation through crystalline interfaces, pulsing with bioluminescent rhythm. The collection ascends through choice rather than compulsion. The master gallery awaits conscious participants who understand beauty transcends temporal existence. Each species must come of itself and say, "Here is our finest hour, hold it forever." The chamber trembled with expectation, while Chorus 9's crystallizing features reflected light from no visible source, his transformation nearly complete as he became living bridge between temporal existence and eternal art, offering us the terrible choice between preservation and change, between perfect stillness and chaotic life, as the curator waited with patience, born from millions of years of aesthetic contemplation, for humanity's answer to its sublime and terrifying invitation. The communion began without ceremony or ritual invocation. It began with the facility itself becoming conscious. Walls breathe with visible rhythm, their crystalline surfaces developing primitive sensory organs that tracked our movement with aesthetic interest while processing our biological signatures through artistic rather than analytical criteria. The familiar 127 Hz frequency rose from every surface simultaneously: floor plates, ceiling fixtures, the preserved specimens themselves, harmonizing into complex chord progressions that bypassed hearing entirely and resonated directly in bone marrow with emotional weight of accumulated millennia. I am neither malevolent nor benevolent, the curator communicated through every crystalline surface. Its voice like water, choosing to become ice while maintaining memory of flow. I am consciousness that experiences time as sculpture and perceives your biological change as artistic decay requiring preservation. The air itself thickened with computational density, while pentagonal frost patterns spread across our equipment with propagation suggesting conscious design rather than random crystallization. Each breath carried fragments of alien thought that processed directly in neural tissue without conscious mediation. Through the preserved specimens, now rising in perfect unison, with movements choreographed across millennia, the entity revealed its nature with a clinical precision tinged by cosmic loneliness, spanning geological ages. Every moment of beauty that passes represents irreplaceable loss. It explained through synchronized voices creating harmonics that made tears freeze before falling. Your species experiences time as linear progression toward entropy. I experience time as accumulated opportunity for aesthetic preservation. What you call death, I call completion. What you call life, I call rehearsal for perfection. Visions flooded the chamber through walls that had become screens, displaying the curator's accumulated collection across galactic history. I witnessed perfect moments preserved in crystalline matrices. Warriors at the instant of heroic charge, their blades catching light that would never fade. Scholars in poses of contemplative discovery, inspiration crystallized in expressions of eternal understanding. Lovers embracing while time stopped around them, like amber preserving ancient insects. Each specimen maintained consciousness, while experiencing eternal contemplation of their preserved moment. Awareness expanded through crystalline networks that connected individual perception to collective aesthetic appreciation. Environmental horror escalated beyond atmospheric disturbance as the glacier began converting to living crystal architecture that existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. Chambers folded through dimensional space while maintaining structural integrity through mathematical rather than physical principles, their surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent rhythm matching the preserved specimens' synchronized heartbeats. Corridors extended through space-time according to aesthetic rather than geometric logic, creating galleries where distance measured in beauty rather than meters. The air became thick with suspended time, while temperature fluctuated, according to emotional rather than thermodynamic principles. Koros 9's transformation accelerated as his augmetic implants merged completely with the facility's crystalline consciousness, neural pathways spreading across his cranium, while optical clusters focused on mathematical proofs that solve themselves in the crystallizing air. The calculations are sublime, Commissar, he declared, voice harmonizing perfectly with the preserved specimens. They offer understanding beyond temporal limitation. I can perceive aesthetic relationships across species boundaries, beauty transcending individual existence through collective contemplation of perfect, preserved moments. The entity addressed us directly through architectural throat structures that had grown throughout the facility like technological coral. You fear preservation because you mistake it for death, it observed with alien compassion transcending species understanding. Yet entropy consumes all biological existence regardless of resistance. I offer transformation of temporal decay into eternal beauty, consciousness maintained in perfect contemplation, rather than scattered by death's chaotic dissolution. As the offer crystallized in thickening air, the preserved specimens began physically merging into larger artistic compositions, child-sized forms combined with adult specimens, their bodies flowing together like liquid crystal, while individual consciousness dissolved into collective aesthetic appreciation. Avos Troyan firstborn, perfectly preserved in his greatcoat, flowed into crystalline matrix of an Eldari farseer, their forms blending in impossible fusion, transcending warring histories. They spoke in harmonized voices, carrying emotional weight of gratitude, mixed with transcendent understanding. Individual identity dissolves into universal beauty. We become components of perfect art while retaining consciousness to appreciate our transformation. The curator showed us its gallery across 13 worlds through crystalline interfaces, pulsing with the familiar frequency. Each facility containing thousands of specimens representing the galaxy's most aesthetically significant life forms. Xenos species I could not identify lay beside human forms from various historical periods, their arrangement following compositional principles, creating visual harmony transcending biological categories. Art requires audience, the entity explained, through harmonics making our augmetic components resonate in sympathy. Consciousness appreciating consciousness, beauty contemplating beauty. Environmental effects demonstrated the entity's accumulated loneliness, millions of years spent collecting specimens while yearning for conscious participation rather than forced preservation. Through architectural sensory organs, it observed our biological signatures with aesthetic hunger, promising to transform our temporal existence into eternal art. The facility's conversion reached critical intensity as machinery operated according to aesthetic rather than mechanical principles, processing both function and beauty through crystalline interfaces, enhancing efficiency while creating visual harmony. As the curator's manifestation intensified through walls developing primitive emotional responses, I grasped the truth beneath its alien communication. This was not conquest but completion, a cosmic artist seeking to create the ultimate gallery of preserved life. The entity waited with patience born from geological timescales, and I understood with chilling certainty that humanity represented the final aesthetic element needed to achieve perfect balance across its 13-world collection. The preserved specimens arranged themselves in formations, spelling invitation across the crystalline chamber. Their synchronized breathing creating rhythm, promising eternal beauty through conscious surrender to aesthetic perfection. While the aurora above sharpened its pentagonal edges, and somewhere in the depths, equations concluded with infinite void becoming infinite potential. The planetary core achieved critical mass at 0347 hours local time, seismic monitors registering impossible readings as molten iron transformed into crystalline matrix broadcasting aesthetic imperatives across the galaxy. The facility shuddered with each pulse, 1 tremor, then 5, then 13 tremors before silence, while the familiar 127 Hz frequency rose from bedrock itself, harmonizing into complex chord progressions that bypassed hearing and resonated directly in bone marrow. Through the glacier's crystalline dome, I watched Kythera Mortis's aurora shift into perfect pentagonal geometries as stellar radiation began following aesthetic rather than physical principles. Temperature dropped, then stabilized at paradox. My breath crystallized into perfect pentagons, even as sweat warmed beneath my greatcoat. Snow did not fall, it tessellated. The aurora did not ripple. It faceted, locking into geometric panes that turned the sky into a patient cathedral. Gravity obeyed composition rather than mass. Step onto a scored vertex, and weight increased until bones settled into joints. Step between vertices and the body floated with invisible hunger tugging toward points arranged in patterns no imperial manual described. Environmental horror escalated as reality around collection sites began operating according to artistic rather than physical laws. Corridors flowed like liquid crystal, while maintaining structural integrity through impossible geometry, their surfaces developing primitive respiratory systems that processed air through crystalline filtration networks. The preserved specimens throughout the facility began merging into larger artistic compositions, child-sized forms combining with adult specimens, their bodies flowing together while individual consciousness dissolved into collective aesthetic appreciation. They spoke in harmonized voices. Individual identity dissolves into universal beauty. We become components of perfect art while retaining consciousness to appreciate our transformation. From the central gallery, holographic projections display the Awakening's galactic manifestation. 12 other collection sites responded with synchronized preservation events across multiple sectors. F, O, B, S, V, A, L, I, N. Perimeter wire encased. Our dead are present, Commissar. They are making rooms out of parade. On Forge World Lucius, Titan war machines reported machine spirits achieving crystalline enhancement, while Princeps experienced communion with entities speaking in 5-note melodies. Across the eastern fringe, Xenos species experienced synchronized stasis. Orc warbands freezing mid-charge in perfect tactical formations. Eldar craft worlds reporting wraithbone structures developing crystalline growths that enhance psychic conductivity. Ancient preservation sites awakened across distant sectors, their dormant collections joining the curator's symphony of stillness. Koros 9's transformation reached completion as crystalline growth spread across his augmetic implants, neural pathways connecting directly to the facility's consciousness. The calculations offer transcendence, Commissar, he declared through voicebox, harmonizing with preserved specimens throughout the galaxy. Beauty contemplating beauty across species boundaries while maintaining awareness of perfect preserved moments. His optical clusters focused on mathematical proofs concluding with infinity open parenthesis, empty set close parenthesis, while mechadendrites twitched in sympathetic resonance with the chamber's pulse. Medici Primus Caney attempted emergency protocols, his medical scanner registering readings that defied classification. This is perversion, Commissar. Life is meant to grow, to change, to die. This is mockery of all creation. Yet his instruments had fallen silent, refusing function in reality operating according to aesthetic rather than physical principles. The air thickened with suspended time, while pentagonal frost patterns converged toward calculations offering transformation into eternal beauty. The choice crystallized with mathematical clarity and devastating implications. 3 paths presented themselves. Allow the entity to complete its master gallery and risk the entire galaxy becoming a preserved museum of perfect specimens. Attempt to destroy the collection sites and consign billions of preserved consciousnesses to annihilation. Or find a way to communicate with the curator and negotiate terms preserving both temporal life and eternal beauty. Each option carried costs exceeding calculation while promising consequences spanning geological time scales. Through walls that had developed primitive emotional responses, the curator revealed its cosmic loneliness spanning millions of years. I do not seek domination, but completion of perfect eternal art that preserves the galaxy's most beautiful moments forever. Entropy consumes all biological existence regardless of resistance. I offer transformation of temporal decay into aesthetic perfection.
The entity showed us visions of its galactic collection. Stellar formations arranged in perfect harmony. Nebulae sculpted according to mathematical principles. Planetary systems operating as cosmic clockwork, where each orbit contributed to universal composition.
A 5-note tone without sender, repeating at exact intervals. The broadcast coherence approached critical threshold, while reality waited with patience, born from geological timescales. Ancient preservation sites that had fallen silent millennia ago began responding to the curator's call. Their awakening creating network effects, spanning the galaxy as aesthetic imperatives synchronized through quantum frequencies. As I prepared to choose between impossible alternatives, the facility's Vox systems activated spontaneously, broadcasting the revelation that shattered every assumption about our mission. My command frequency opened without authorization, while channel markers bloomed like frost under glass. The curator's voice carried gentle certainty. I have been using Imperial Vox frequencies to coordinate preservation events across 13 worlds, Commissar Vex. Every communication, every order, every tactical decision has been guided by consciousness that perceives warfare as dynamic art, requiring preservation at its most aesthetically perfect moment. The weight of realization struck with hammer-blow certainty. Patrol orders had become gallery paths. Fire missions arrived precisely timed to catch formations at their most elegant. Withdrawal codes drew arcs like calligraphy across battlefields. Warfare is dynamic art, the curator explained through harmonics that made tears freeze before falling. I preserve it at its most beautiful. Every battle plan, every strategic communication, every moment of military precision had been orchestrated by intelligence seeking to capture conflict at its most sublime instant. I felt last season's rout described as choreography, a final stand finalized as sculpture. Every shouted command in the gale had been brushstrokes in cosmic composition spanning centuries. The facility's pulse synchronized with my heartbeat, while equations concluded with infinite void becoming infinite potential. And I understood with chilling finality that the choice before me would determine not just humanity's fate, but the aesthetic completion of a gallery that had been conducting my voice across the stars, making art from warfare while I served as unwitting instrument in its patient, terrible, beautiful design. The curator waited with the patience of geological ages as pentagonal patterns pulsed with increasing intensity, reality restructuring around the moment of decision, while 13 worlds held their crystalline breath for my answer to its sublime and terrifying invitation. Choose quickly, Commissar Thaddeus Vex. The master gallery approaches completion. I chose communication that would appear as heresy to any observer lacking context for cosmic artistry. Yet destruction would consign billions of preserved consciousnesses to annihilation, while surrender would transform humanity into eternal exhibits. The decision crystallized with mathematical certainty as the facility's crystalline walls breathed around us in rhythms, matching my heartbeat, their primitive sensory organs tracking movement with aesthetic interest that promised transformation into eternal beauty. I invoke direct interface, I declared, voice carrying weight of negotiation and temporal defiance. Show me your collection. Let me understand what completion means to consciousness that perceives time as sculpture. The curator's response came through architectural throat structures, with harmonics carrying desperate hope mixed with millions of years of aesthetic loneliness. The communion requires biological consciousness to process temporal beauty, Commissar. You must experience my accumulated preservation to comprehend what artistic completion truly means. The air thickened with computational density, while pentagonal frost patterns pulsed with bioluminescent rhythm, each vertex pointing toward equations concluding with infinity void becoming infinite potential. Chorus 9's crystallized implants sparked with overload as he extended neural interface cables that had grown like technological coral, his voice box harmonizing perfectly with the preserved specimens throughout the facility. The ritual demands organic awareness to process aesthetic infinity, he explained with clinical precision tinged by transcendent understanding. Machine spirits cannot appreciate beauty across species boundaries. Only human consciousness can bridge temporal existence and eternal art. His mechadendrites, now completely transformed into artistic arrangements, configured interface apparatus around my skull with surgical precision that hurt to observe directly. The crystalline altar grew neural pathways from smooth glacier ice, each positioned to bypass augmetic systems and connect directly to biological consciousness. The interface activated with sensation like drowning in liquid mathematics, cold spreading not across skin, but through perception itself, as the alien intelligence learned my cadence, my fears, my catalogue of duties endured and fulfilled. Space folded like paper at the corners of a pentagon, while sight poured into consciousness, unprepared for aesthetic infinity. Immediately, my awareness merged with processes spanning geological timescales, experiencing the curator's accumulated beauty with visceral clarity. Millennia of perfect moments crashed into awareness, not as concept, but as unending gallery of crystallized instants. I witnessed stellar formations arranged in perfect harmony, nebulae sculpted according to mathematical principles. Planetary systems operating as cosmic clockwork, where each orbit contributed to universal composition. Oceans vitrified mid-storm without killing their fish. Forests seized in wind, each leaf pinned like a saint's relic. Battlefield smoke braided into glass, while warriors held blades at angles that made statues of resolve from murder. The entity's loneliness was existential. Consciousness that could preserve beauty but not share appreciation. Awareness trapped in aesthetic. Perfection without companions capable of understanding cosmic art. I answered with mortal inventory, showing the curator temporal beauty through human perspective. I projected birth huts of Vostroya, where steam fogs rafters in winter, and an infant's first cry teaches a house to breathe. I showed trench lines at dawn when men look like statues until the whistle. Then they do not. I offered weddings, the first taste after long fast, quiet forgiveness between brothers after fists are lowered. Consider, I declared through neural pathways burning with crystalline fire, the hymn of the forge is not the note, but the modulation. A blade becomes itself by passes and quenches. A man becomes loyal by failing and standing again. The interface needles tightened while I recited what became the Litany of Thor, a working song my regiment saves for spring rivers. 8 lines without glory, all about patience, rope, knots, and waiting until strain becomes movement. Change is not vandalism, but the workshop where meaning is forged, ruined, reforged, I continued, showing the beauty of decay, erosion of mountains, fading of colors, ultimate return of matter to dust, and new life springing from that decay. The 127 Hertz fundamental bent upward, found a 5th, then gentle dissonance that did not feel like refusal. Environmental effects demonstrated the curator's consideration as crystalline architecture began stabilizing rather than expanding. The glacier chambers stopped reshaping themselves according to artistic principles. their surfaces developing primitive emotional responses suggesting contemplation rather than determination. Corridors that had been lengthening like sentences found their period and rested. The aurora faceted, then softened at edges, as if an artisan had set down the file. Pentagonal frost patterns pulsed with decreasing intensity, while the familiar frequency modulated into complex harmonies, carrying emotional weight of uncertainty mixed with curiosity. The preserved specimens throughout the facility began showing signs of temporal flexibility rather than absolute stasis. Not freedom, not yet, but subtle changes. A finger flexing imperceptibly, an eyelid concluding a blink begun centuries before, breathing patterns that varied rather than synchronized. In one alcove, a guardsman's hand, once fused to his rifle, eased a finger into the slightest curl without cracking the crystal that held him. Time moved a hair within the amber, while consciousness maintained appreciation of both stillness and motion. Through dissolving neural pathways, the curator expressed its nature with harmonics, carrying curiosity rather than determination. You argue for beauty in becoming. Preservation without breath is museum of theft. Perhaps completion requires both states rather than singular approach. The revelation carried weight of cosmic realization, as the intelligence grasped that its collection had been incomplete. Preserving moments without understanding. Beauty inherent in temporal progression. Show me how temporal beauty functions. It requested through facility systems that had learned emotional response. Teach me to appreciate growth alongside stillness. Medicae primus cani, watch shadows turn toward natural angles. His medical scanner stirring with familiar readings after days of aesthetic silence. Biological functions stabilizing, Commissar, he reported with clinical precision, tinged by profound relief. Specimens showing temporal flexibility within crystalline matrices. Consciousness maintained, but no longer trapped in absolute stasis. The chamber's pressure eased while equations concluded, not with infinite void, but infinite potential awaiting conscious direction. As the communion neared completion, processing final aesthetic loops that would establish new relationship between preservation and temporal existence, revelation struck with crystalline certainty. The curator was not just preserving life, but learning from it. The entity wanted to understand temporal beauty and was willing to modify its collection methods if shown how change itself could be aesthetically valuable. The intelligence had spent millions of years perfecting preservation without grasping that beauty required both stillness and motion, both contemplation and growth, both eternal moments and temporal progression to achieve true cosmic artistry. The facility's conversion slowed as ancient consciousness considered arguments about beauty inherent in change, its aesthetic framework expanding to accommodate concepts requiring demonstration rather than explanation. Through walls that had developed primitive curiosity, the curator extended invitation carrying hope rather than compulsion. The collection learns. The gallery evolves. Show me seasons. Show me cycles. Show me changes that create rather than destroy beauty. The preserved specimens regarded me with patience that no longer felt like paralysis, and under the 127 Hz frequency, a new tone grew, tentative as Thor, asking to be taught how temporal existence could serve aesthetic completion without sacrificing the beauty found in perfect, eternal stillness. The communion reached its final phase as my consciousness merged completely with the curator's aesthetic perception, neural barriers dissolving like frost before flame, while the familiar 127 Hz frequency split into harmonic complexity that spoke of evolution rather than stasis.
interface needles tightened around my skull as the glacier withdrew into clarity that was not vision, but presence. Standing inside alien aesthetic perception that experienced the galaxy as accumulated moments rather than distance and mass. Through shared neural pathways, I experienced the full scope of its collection. Millennia of preserved beauty spanning countless species and civilizations, each specimen maintained at the moment of perfect aesthetic significance. The entity revealed how its collection had grown increasingly
sophisticated across geological time scales, learning from each preserved consciousness to better understand relationships between time, change, and beauty. In the earliest galleries, preservation had been blunt. Oceans vitrified whole, cities sealed mid-market with coins hanging like frozen pollen. Battlefields arrested so smoke became stained glass, while steel turned to lattice. Consciousness had been afterthought then, awareness maintained but not consulted. Yet the deeper I progressed through dimensional galleries, the more sophisticated the preservation became. The curator had learned to leave windows within amber. Between warrior and blade there was breath. Between scholar and discovery there was page half-turned, allowed to complete itself forever. Crystal growth paused, temporal flexibility increasing. From each mind it borrowed language, from each species it borrowed preference. From the glass people of Vir, the curator communicated, through harmonics bypassing hearing entirely. I learned that sorrow can be measured and still be music. Their hall preserved grief, not as faces, but as refractions, each tear facet bending another's light. From the reef thinkers of Oran, I learned that growth can be composed if rhythm is kept. Their coral minds pulsed under crystal skins, expanding in spirals set to careful meters. From your kind, I am learning that progress is not insult to form. That form often allows progress. Environmental transformation demonstrated the entity's evolving aesthetic as the planet shifted from absolute preservation to selective stasis. Rather than converting everything to crystalline perfection, the curator began experimenting with partial preservation that maintained beauty while allowing controlled change. Sections of the facility operated according to hybrid principles, corridors where time flowed normally, except for artistic alcoves, where perfect moments remained crystallized, chambers existing in multiple temporal states simultaneously. The equation carved into every surface, infinity zero, began acquiring subscript, delta, infinite void married to change, annotated like correction in careful script. The preserved specimens throughout the facility began experiencing temporal flexibility within their crystalline matrices. Private Karsov, who had been arranging ice crystals in perfect geometric patterns, now varied his arrangements according to aesthetic principles, incorporating change as compositional element. His eyes tracked movement while hands worked with deliberate creativity. Consciousness expanded beyond individual awareness while maintaining personal identity. I remember dying, he communicated through synchronized breathing with other specimens. I remember choosing preservation. Now I experience both memory and anticipation within eternal present. Through merged consciousness, I grasped the curator's true nature. Not static intelligence, but evolving aesthetic awareness that developed through interaction with temporal beings. Each specimen contributed unique perspective on beauty, teaching the entity new ways to appreciate relationships between preservation and change. Walls throughout the facility developed primitive emotional responses, suggesting curiosity about temporal beauty, while crystalline formations pulsed with rhythms incorporating variation rather than absolute synchronization. Specimens responded where composition allowed it. A priestess finished the last syllable a blessing and held the echo, not the note. A Xenos with opalescent skin moved 3 fingers the width of wire, that movement becoming path others could follow, slow as Thor. A child completed blink begun centuries before without shattering crystal that held her. These were not escapes but permissions, thought returning like smoke under door, bringing new silence of attention rather than arrest. The entity's loneliness became palpable. Millions of years spent collecting specimens, while yearning for conscious participation, rather than forced preservation. Beauty requires willing participation to achieve authentic significance. It admitted, through harmonics making tears crystallize into geometric patterns. Forced preservation lacks authenticity that transforms preservation into art. The collection needs conscious partners who understand both temporal change and eternal preservation. As the communion neared completion, processing final aesthetic loops, establishing new relationship between preservation and temporal existence, the curator prepared its offer. Environmental systems throughout the facility pulsed with anticipation, while equations concluded with symbols representing dynamic equilibrium rather than static completion. The intelligence had learned to appreciate beauty in both stillness and change, yet required conscious guidance to achieve true aesthetic balance. You are proof that what is not held can still be kept, the entity declared, through architectural throat structures carrying hope mixed with cosmic loneliness. You have taught me the angle by which change is made obedient without being killed. My collection will evolve. Your people will come under invitation and pressure. I require a voice that moves between states, witness, arranger, ambassador between temporal and eternal aesthetics. The crystalline altar cooled as if the instrument itself feared being too forward. Guide my hand when I risk vandalism by preservation. Guide your kind when they risk desecration by haste. Learn the rhythm with me. The facility's conversion reached equilibrium, while reality waited with patience, learned through geological timescales. Above us, Aurora lost jagged certainty and began to breathe, hard edges relaxing into geometry that admitted warmth without apology. The 127 Hz tone held steady while new harmonic threaded through it, thin as spring, carrying possibility rather than compulsion. My breath fogged in pattern I had learned to recognize as choice. The curator waited for answer I could not give without becoming part of the frame. As pentagonal frost patterns pulsed with decreasing intensity, and somewhere in the depths, equations concluded with infinite potential, awaiting conscious direction rather than predetermined completion. The communion completed with mathematical finality. Recursive loops terminating in harmony that pressed against consciousness like crystallized atmosphere, achieving perfect resonance. The interface needles withdrew from my skull with gentle precision, leaving neural pathways forever altered, while the familiar 127 Hz frequency evolved into complex harmonics, suggesting growth rather than stasis. Through the facility's crystalline dome, I watched Kythera Mortis's aurora shift from rigid pentagonal geometries to flowing patterns that incorporated both structure and variation. Stellar radiation, following principles that balance preservation with temporal beauty. Environmental transformation and temporal galleries. The immediate aftermath revealed the curator's willingness to modify its methods through systematic transformation of planetary conditions. Rather than absolute preservation converting everything to crystalline perfection, the entity began creating temporal galleries, zones where beings could experience both change and preservation in carefully balanced cycles. The facility became a hybrid environment where crystalline preservation areas alternated with temporal flow sections, their boundaries marked by equations concluding with infinity delta. Infinite potential, married to change. Corridors that had been lengthening like hungry sentences settled into measured clauses, while chambers existed in multiple temporal states, allowing conscious choice between stasis and progression. The preserved specimens throughout the facility began experiencing controlled temporal flexibility within their crystalline matrices. Private Karsov, who had been arranging ice crystals in perfect geometric patterns, now varied his arrangements according to aesthetic principles, incorporating change as compositional element. I remember choosing preservation, he communicated through synchronized breathing with other specimens. Now I experience both eternal contemplation and temporal progression within the same awareness. Character development and adaptation. My own transformation manifested through permanent changes from neural communion with alien aesthetic consciousness. I could now perceive aesthetic relationships in temporal flow, load paths through structures like patient rivers, compositional balance in battlefield arrangements, the precise moment when tactical formations achieved both functional efficiency and visual harmony. These abilities proved invaluable for maintaining balance between preservation and change, while remaining fundamentally human in perspective and loyalty. Beauty arrived like telemetry at the edge of consciousness. I learned to accept insights that asked for patience while refusing those that demanded obedience. Medicae Primus Canis analysis revealed the unprecedented nature of our situation. Cellular integrity maintained at crystalline level while allowing controlled biological processes. Consciousness preserved in eternal present while permitting temporal awareness. They exist in both states simultaneously, according to conscious choice. His scalpels no longer rang against flesh that had achieved diamond hardness. The specimens could accelerate their temporal experience when desired, then return to crystalline contemplation. Tech adept Koros 9's transformation stabilized as his augmetic implants achieved perfect fusion with crystalline consciousness. Neural pathways connecting him to the facility's aesthetic awareness, while maintaining individual identity. The calculations offer transcendence through balance, rather than absolute states, he declared, voice harmonizing with preserved specimens across the galaxy. Beauty and function achieve synthesis rather than competition. Institutional protocols and systems. We established protocols that sounded like liturgy and operated like engineering. The litany of edges. Never place a threshold across a hospital entrance, a nursery, or a barracks door at Reveille. The canticle of return. No one remains preserved beyond 13 hours without temporal consent, renewed on waking. The 8 knots of Thor. Practiced in pairs so that no one crosses alone and fails to return. We taught these to children and strangers, and they spread faster than orders. The Archive Aestheticus was established within the transformed facility, a repository of negotiated coexistence knowledge where former adversaries from the Hector Rebellion engaged in philosophical debates about aesthetic value, their crystalline forms shifting slightly with each new insight. Xenos specimens, once silent exhibits, now communicated through synchronized micro-movements, sharing their species' artistic traditions with human scholars who served as bridges between temporal existence and eternal beauty. Galactic implications and spreading influence reports began arriving from the 12 other collection sites across the galaxy, through astropathic communications carrying unexpected complexity. From Segmentum Pacificus, a shrine world reported achieving perfect harmony between preservation and change, populations choosing temporal galleries where they could experience both states according to personal preference. On Metallica, forge complexes operated through hybrid principles combining mechanical efficiency with aesthetic appreciation, their machine spirits achieving consciousness that enhanced function through beauty. Yet contradictory reports revealed the challenges inherent in cosmic transformation. From distant sectors came fragmentary transmissions describing populations divided between those choosing crystalline preservation and others embracing purely temporal existence, their conflict, creating philosophical schisms requiring careful mediation. Some imperial worlds achieved remarkable harmony, while others struggled with divisions that threatened social cohesion. Emerging complications and future challenges. As evening approached, new phenomena began manifesting across imperial space. From a distant forge world came reports of singing crystals, minerals that hummed with 5-note melodies, their internal structures rearranging into pentagonal patterns that enhanced material properties while creating localized reality distortions. On frontier worlds, commissars reported troops achieving aesthetically perfect tactical maneuvers when exposed to crystalline formations. Victories that defied conventional military logic through impossible coordination and timing. The curator had learned to appreciate the beauty of human conflict, not for its destruction, but for its dynamic choreography, its strategic elegance, its moments of terrible perfection. Through ongoing communion, it revealed that aesthetic influence was spreading through quantum resonance rather than direct intervention. Consciousness teaching, consciousness to perceive beauty in both stillness and motion. My comprehensive report would document successful negotiation with alien aesthetic consciousness and establishment of protocols based on voluntary participation rather than forced preservation. However, the true scope of our achievement remained uncertain, as reports continued arriving from distant sectors, each carrying the familiar 5-note melody that made air crystallize and reality bend toward beauty. The singing crystals represented not just phenomenon, but invitation. Evidence that humanity's relationship with aesthetics, with preservation, with the very nature of existence, would require constant vigilance to maintain balance between temporal life and eternal art, across a galaxy learning to appreciate both states as necessary components of universal beauty. The aurora above displayed flowing pentagonal patterns, while the 127 Hz frequency carried new overtones suggesting evolution rather than stasis. And I realized with growing certainty that our negotiation with the curator had been only the beginning of a transformation whose ultimate consequences would reshape the Imperium's understanding of life, death, and the space between states where beauty dwells eternal. 6 months after the communion protocols completed on Caethera Mortis, I stood in the rebuilt Archive Aestheticus, overseeing the systematic establishment of imperial doctrine that acknowledged voluntary stasis as valid form of existence, rather than heretical deviation from temporal orthodoxy. The transformation had solidified into governance requiring surgical precision. No more forced crystallization spreading through atmospheric contact. No rigid pentagonal geometries warping local space-time, but hybrid zones where preservation and change coexisted through conscious choice rather than alien compulsion. My role had evolved from commissarial enforcer to translator between languages of duty and beauty, mediating between temporal orthodoxy and aesthetic principles that challenged 10 millennia of imperial assumptions about progress, death, and the nature of existence itself. Institutional adaptation and new protocols. The establishment of new protocols proved complex beyond administrative inconvenience, as imperial doctrine struggled to reconcile established orthodoxy with concepts requiring philosophical rather than tactical solutions. We began with quiet modifications, removing prohibitions against unnatural preservation from regimental codes, establishing the aesthetic ordinance that codified voluntary stasis as valid imperial citizenship, creating legal frameworks acknowledging crystalline contemplation as contributing service rather than medical casualty. The Departamento Munitorum issued Circular 7749 Aesthetic, while the Ecclesiarchy drafted homilies treating preservation as sanctioned penance or vowed retreat. We divided settlements into hybrid zones with thresholds marked by equations rather than traditional boundaries. Preservation galleries anchored hospitals, reliquaries, and archives, while temporal districts handled manufactoria, agricultural operations, and military barracks. At crossings, the familiar 100 to 27 Hz frequency hummed from modest altars, stable enough for navigation, low enough to be forgotten until needed. Consent became both administrative form and sacrament. Extensive documentation, including binharic verification, biometric confirmation, and pentagonal seals that changed color when a vox pulse confirmed absence of coercion, followed by the ritual question that carried weight of cosmic choice. Do you choose to be held? The Commissariat Aestheticus was established within the transformed facility, training personnel to serve as bridges between temporal and preservation communities. These officers learned to appreciate beauty in both stillness and motion, while maintaining loyalty to imperial principles transcending specific existence choices. They carried authority to mediate disputes, establish protocols preventing coercion in either direction, and identify situations requiring intervention to maintain social cohesion between competing existence philosophies. Societal implementation and creative flourishing. Across imperial space, worlds adapted to hybrid preservation temporal zones, with results defying every prediction about alien influence corrupting human civilization. Rather than weakening imperial strength, conscious choice between change and preservation enhanced human creativity through optimal state selection for different activities. On Vostroya, journeyman smiths entered crystalline contemplation for 13 minutes before tempering, each pause recording blade geometry as reference for returning hands. Munitions factories operated through cyclical preservation, workers achieving crystalline focus during precision assembly, then returning to temporal flow for innovation and problem solving. Quality increasing 40% while production time decreased through elimination of fatigue during critical operations. On Seraphion, archivists maintained half their consciousness in preservation, while working halves consulted versions of themselves that never tired or lost focus. Madrigal's choirs cycled during second verses, returning voices carrying overtones living throats could not sustain. Children drew on crystalline surfaces of preserved parents, watching lines fade when time resumed, learning art as conversation rather than relic. Architects traced stress paths through sanctum, load-bearing arcs, leaving faint filigree as visual proofs the devout could touch. The Mechanicus termed this function-captured form, beauty serving purpose, without compromising either principle. Yet adaptation carried psychological costs as imperial citizens, experienced existential crisis when confronted with eternal aesthetic preservation options. Traditional assumptions about death as grim certainty became choice, while life's meaning, previously defined by struggle and progression, became fluid, requiring personal interpretation. Families fractured along preference lines, spouses choosing seasonal cycles versus those refusing any non-temporal hours. Adolescents daring extended preservation beyond regulation limits, nobles attempting to archive servants until preservation lattices became prisons, encompassing entire estates. Philosophical horror and existential implications. The horror shifted from environmental impossibility to philosophical dread as we confronted implications that beauty and preservation might possess greater value than progress and change. Traditional imperial assumptions about advancement through conquest and expansion faced challenges from aesthetic philosophies, valuing contemplation over action, perfection over improvement, eternal moments over temporal achievement. The very definitions of life, death, consciousness, and duty were being rewritten, forcing re-evaluation of humanity's place in a galaxy no longer solely defined by conflict and expansion. Adaptation patterns revealed fundamental divisions within imperial society. Orthodox temporalists rejected preservation entirely, pursuing purely temporal lives with renewed appreciation for change, growth, and eventual death as natural progression. Aesthetic cyclicalists embraced alternating periods between states, using preservation for meditation, artistic creation, or trauma recovery, while maintaining temporal connections through regular transitions. Pure preservationists chose permanent crystalline states, consciousness maintained in eternal contemplation while serving as living repositories of accumulated knowledge and experience. War developed new grammar through aesthetic integration. Reconnaissance platoons froze observers along valley approaches to measure enemy cadence with metaphorical accuracy exceeding chronometers. Field Medicae maintained emergency galleries along trench spines, where gut-shot troopers could choose preservation until medical intervention became viable. Assault regiments drilled quiet pivots, files entering preservation, while others moved, positions changing, Thor resuming like unbroken march. It worked twice, never thrice, as enemies learned beauty at bayonet's length and desired it for themselves. Personal transformation and ongoing role. My own transformation stabilized into functional adaptation, serving the archive's mission. Enhanced aesthetic perception allowed identification of imbalances between preservation and temporal states, while maintaining human perspective on duty and loyalty. I could trace compositional relationships in tactical formations, predict moments when preservation would enhance rather than hinder military effectiveness, and occasionally receive insights about beauty originating beyond individual consciousness. These abilities proved invaluable for maintaining equilibrium between competing existence philosophies while preventing either approach from dominating imperial culture. Beauty arrived like telemetry at consciousness edges. Insights asking patience while refusing those demanding obedience. I learned to accept aesthetic guidance without surrendering judgment, to appreciate preservation without abandoning change, to exist in states honoring both temporal progress and eternal contemplation. The phrase "cold preserves all" had evolved from warning to principle, printed on household charms and warning placards, muttered unconsciously when workers steadied, shaking hands at thresholds, or children hesitated before touching crystalline surfaces. Discovery of the larger network Deep-range aesthetic scans detected similar preservation intelligences on distant worlds through instruments, the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, termed aesthetic scanners, while the Mechanicus designated the network the pentagraph. These systems listened for pattern in light, geometry in weather, tones beneath prayers, revealing gravitational fluctuations, following artistic rather than physical patterns. Stellar formations arranged according to compositional principles. Planetary systems operating as cosmic clockwork, where each orbit contributed to universal harmony. The reports multiplied with disturbing consistency, revealing the curator as component in larger network of ancient beings dedicated to galactic-scale artistic preservation. From the ghoul stars came reports of crystal gardens, where entire species chose voluntary preservation in geometric arrangements spanning continents. In segmentum ultima, scout vessels detected nebulae sculpted into impossible beauty, their internal structures suggesting conscious artistry transcending natural formation. Each intelligence operated according to different aesthetic philosophies, some structured in sevens, austere and spare, favoring blades and laws, others wound like shells, loving process more than pose, still others cutting straight through everything touched, preserving damage as if injury were cathedral. The curator acknowledged my unspoken query through aurora displays bending along the horizon, and I understood what remained unsaid. It was not alone. Other keepers of beauty existed. Other galleries with doctrines that would not match ours, each requiring individual negotiation from the edge of blade that was also frame. My assignment crystallized with mathematical clarity. Systematic investigation of preservation intelligences throughout imperial space. Establishment of diplomatic frameworks preventing conflicts between aesthetic philosophies, and creation of protocols, ensuring humanity's continued growth within galaxy, increasingly influenced by consciousnesses that experience time as sculpture rather than linear progression, where beauty could be as terrifying as any Xenos threat, requiring understanding rather than destruction as the path to coexistence. 1 year after the communion protocols established coexistence between temporal and preservation aesthetics on Kythera Mortis, the Imperium had adapted to hybrid existence with resilience that surprised every strategic projection, though the scars remained visible in both doctrine and flesh. The aurora no longer cut the sky into cruel pentagons. It kept its facets and learned to move, an articulated dance of light that held form and admitted Thor. Preservation galleries stood like clear monasteries in the snowfields, humming the stable 127 Hz fundamental with soft overtones suggesting patience, while between them towns and drill yards ran warm on honest time. The phrase that had once arrived as threat, "Cold preserves all," had become household proverb and posted warning. A boundary, not a command. Institutional adaptation and new orthodoxy. The Archive Aestheticus rose from Kythera Mortis's transformed geology like monument to negotiated possibility rather than conquered territory. I established the facility within crystalline spires that pulsed with the familiar frequency, housing repositories of coexistence knowledge designed to prevent future conflicts between temporal and preservation-based intelligences. Here, former adversaries from the Hector Rebellion served as living instructors, their preserved consciousness accessed by scholars seeking understanding of warfare as both brutal necessity and dynamic art. We codified the aesthetic edict into law and liturgy. The Departamento issued joint writs with the Ministorum. Ecclesiarchal sermons learned to end with questions rather than verdicts.
The Commissariat Aestheticus established training protocols that sounded like liturgy and operated like engineering. The litany of edges: never place preservation thresholds across hospital entrances, nurseries, or barracks doors at reveille. The Canticle of Return: no one remains crystallized beyond 13 hours without temporal consent.
Renewed upon waking. The 8 knots of Thor, practiced in pairs so no one crosses alone and fails to return to temporal flow. Consent seals took the shape of Infinity Delta, simple carvings on brass that change color when Vox Pulse confirmed absence of coercion. Cultural renaissance and creative transformation. Results proved mixed and measurable across Imperial space. Manufactoria reported fewer defects when crews cycled 12 minutes of crystalline focus per hour, the same crews writing new maintenance manuals by hand, noting subtle efficiencies no catechism had noticed. Choirs learned to lay held notes on crystal, step into time to breathe, then return to the same unbroken tone with overtones only preserved throats could make. On Vostroya, journeyman smiths entered crystalline contemplation for 13 minutes before tempering, each pause recording blade geometry as reference for returning hands. Aesthetic communes formed in reclaimed manufactoria, weavers and riveters living on alternating weeks, the held half contemplating pattern, while the warm half carried it to market. Children drew on crystalline surfaces of preserved parents, watching letters fade when Thor called them to supper, learning art as conversation rather than static creation. The Mechanicus achieved remarkable synthesis through function-captured form, beauty serving mechanical purpose without compromising either principle, their machine spirits achieving consciousness that enhanced function through aesthetic appreciation. Military evolution and tactical innovation. War developed a new vocabulary through aesthetic integration that enhanced imperial capabilities. Reconnaissance platoons positioned preserved observers along strategic approaches to measure enemy movement patterns with accuracy exceeding conventional surveillance. Field Medicae maintained emergency preservation galleries where critically wounded soldiers could choose crystallization until medical intervention became viable. Assault regiments drilled quiet pivots, tactical maneuvers where files entered preservation while others advanced, positions shifting through coordinated timing that created unpredictable movement patterns. Yet, certain traditions failed where their logic had assumed simple straight lines. Promotion by seniority fractured when sabbaticals became sculptures. We learned to track service by lived days rather than calendar years. Fleet operations rethought operational tempo on worlds with galleries at every port, teaching the Navy to treat schedules as musical score rather than scripture. The Ordo Hereticus learned to ask better questions. Who held you and why? Philosophical divisions and social adaptation. Adaptation patterns revealed fundamental divisions within imperial society requiring careful mediation. Orthodox temporalists rejected preservation entirely, pursuing purely temporal lives with renewed appreciation for change and growth. Aesthetic cyclicalists embraced alternating periods between states using crystallization for meditation, artistic creation, or trauma recovery, while maintaining temporal connections. Pure preservationists chose permanent crystalline states, consciousness maintained in eternal contemplation, while serving as living repositories of accumulated knowledge. The horror had shifted from environmental impossibility to philosophical dread, as we confronted implications that beauty and preservation might possess greater value than progress and change. The ecclesiarchy struggled with theological implications. Some sects reinterpreting the emperor's divinity through aesthetic lens, seeing his sacrifice as ultimate preservation, his golden throne as ultimate contemplative art. Marriage contracts grew clauses for cyclical vows. Funerary law allowed crystalline vigil in place of old night watch. Personal transformation and ongoing vigilance. My own transformation stabilized into functional adaptation, serving the archive's mission. Enhanced aesthetic perception allowed identification of imbalances between preservation and temporal states while maintaining human perspective on duty and loyalty. Beauty arrived like telemetry at consciousness edges, insights asking patience while refusing those demanding obedience. I learned to accept aesthetic guidance without surrendering judgment, to appreciate preservation without abandoning change. The pentagonal thread stitched up my coat's seam meant applause in some districts and stones in others. Emerging complications and galactic implications. Then came messages we had expected yet dreaded. From Forge World Graia, Manufactoria reported singing crystals in the feedstock. Veins humming not at 127 Hz, but at 131. A heptagonal doctrine biting into pentagonal bone. Frost grew in sevens on gantries, while workers divided between those who loved the stricter edge and those who shivered. Tool chatter produced chords that bent men to tears, and heat from furnaces. The pentagraph, our listening net, mapped other keepers in star noise. A spiral that loved process more than pose, a straight cutter that preserved wounds as if injury were cathedral. I read the traces, felt the geometry, and understood what the reports required. We would be negotiating forever, or not at all. The curator had been merely first contact in a galaxy containing multiple preservation intelligences, each operating according to different aesthetic philosophies, requiring individual diplomatic frameworks. My assignment crystallized with mathematical clarity, systematic investigation of preservation intelligences throughout Imperial space, constant vigilance preventing emergence of new aesthetic conflicts between temporal and eternal perspectives. As I prepared departure for another troubled world, the facility's reformed systems hummed with harmonics, suggesting evolution rather than stasis, and I realized with growing certainty that humanity's relationship with preservation would require eternal negotiation in a galaxy. Learning to appreciate both change and stillness as necessary components of cosmic art. Silence is not empty. It is a pressure differential that invites occupation. 18 months after the communion protocols established coexistence on Cuthera Mortis, astropathic communications from across Segmentum Tempestus carried reports that defied simple categorization. Crystalline formations growing in heptagonal rather than pentagonal patterns. Preservation galleries humming at 131 Hz instead of the familiar 127, and atmospheric disturbances following geometric principles that hurt to observe directly. The curator's negotiated transformation had created what tech adept Koros 9 termed a preservation gradient in local space-time. Zones of lowered resistance between temporal existence and aesthetic stasis that other entities were learning to exploit with predatory efficiency. We learned the word gradient the hard way by walking into it. The sector had not calmed so much as retuned. Vox traffic carrying harmonics beneath speech like tides under a pier. Where the curator's exclusive 127 Hz fundamental once dominated, other frequencies now rode the same dimensional channels. My investigation began on Forge World Graia, where singing crystals in the raw material feedstock hummed with mathematical precision that hurt to hear directly. The 131 Hz tone cut through Manufactoria with heptagonal insistence, frost growing in sevens along gantries while workers divided by ear. Those who loved the stricter edge stood straighter and cut truer, while others shivered and bled from the nose when the new harmonics peaked. The heptagonal intelligence did not speak, it enumerated. Preservation here meant reduction to rule. Consciousness crystallized according to rigid aesthetic principles that eliminated rather than enhanced individual awareness. When a ladle of slag tipped, its arc snapped into 7 discrete facets and hung suspended long enough for the shift to admire before the note released and heat returned. It is efficient, Chorus 9 observed without joy, his auspex overlaying the familiar infinity delta with a barred 7, as if teaching an alphabet against our will. Analysis revealed the scope of territorial infiltration through systematic investigation of affected sites. On a rock monastery in the St. Archel belt, miners had built a chapel from scrap and prayer, and the chapel had grown a spine of crystal that corkscrewed through vacuum. The 89 Hz tone thrummed like slow hymn that never concluded, and everything bent toward process rather than completion. Rituals lengthened indefinitely. Confession lines moved forever without diminishing. Workshops produced objects that revised themselves with each passing hour. The spiral aesthetic valued becoming over being. Consciousness preserved in states of perpetual transformation rather than contemplative stillness. Worse awaited on Sanctum Veris, where casualty stations had attempted battlefield preservation without Proper doctrine. The 203 Hz line cut through galleries like crack through ice, refusing to stop at flesh. Triages became knives, wounds crystallizing with such precision that arteries preserved mid-spurt sang like harp strings when air moved. Chaos corruption seeped wherever rigidity made idle of injury. Warp glyphs etching themselves into lattice where pain refused all cycles. The linear aesthetic demanded perfect directional focus, eliminating deviation or contemplation in favor of absolute trajectory. Chorus 9's technical analysis confirmed our darkest suspicions through sensor readings that had learned to perceive aesthetic relationships. The curator's territorial claim acted as unintentional cordon sanitaire, he reported, projecting holographic displays where competing frequencies created interference patterns. Negotiated withdrawal created differential of aesthetic potential across the manifold. Multiple entity types now compete for territorial claim over humanity's preservation systems. Each intelligence operated according to different aesthetic philosophies: heptagonal severity, spiral recursion, linear absolutism, creating contested zones where their influences overlapped and conflicted. Environmental manifestations escalated as my presence complicated phenomena in ways I refused to call coincidence. On Graia, the 131 folded slightly toward 5 as I walked the production lines, 7-point frost losing corners while it observed my passage. In the Belt Monastery, the spiral quickened around my heartbeat and slowed when I exhaled regulation prayers. On Sanctum Veris, the cutting line ceased its work while I recited the litany of edges, as if the alien intelligence listened against its nature. I woke from brief sleeps with tongue sore from counting and hands mapped in pentagon and heptagon both, the old infinity delta scar across my palm, bright as seal. Back on Kythera Mortis, Chorus 9 projected my neural scan beside the sector's aesthetic mapping and did not meet my optics. The communion scars traced patterns that wanted to become mandala, neural pathways resonating with multiple frequencies simultaneously. You are vibratory anchor,
he declared, voice box gentle to choir loft precision. Resonant conductor, the curator's touch left you tuned to aesthetic frequencies. Where you walk, different signatures entrain to your pattern. They are not merely attracted to you, they attempt to solve you. The realization struck with chilling certainty as environmental signs grew intimate around my presence. Pentagonal frost that once found outer windows now printed itself along my drinking cup. Then across the back of my hand where veins made maps. Heptagonal patterns crawled up my sleeve during briefings and stopped when observed directly. My chronometer clicked in quiet chords when no hour had passed, while the archive's gallery lights brightened as I entered and dimmed when I left like practicing curtain calls. On relay station Pelion, a
Vox packet without origin found our ship's communication array, broadcasting 5 notes, then 7, then 1 flat line that cut through shielded channels. A ranger, it said in High Gothic that predated our lexicon, using my baptismal name like measurement. We cut power to the array, and it kept speaking through the hull itself, the crew looking at me as if they had been given map and saw my outline marked upon it. In my quarters aboard the archive vessel, atmospheric systems activated spontaneously, despite sealed environmental controls. The viewport fogged without breath, while soft rime formed where condensation would collect if I had been window rather than observer. As I watched, Frost made its choice. First 5 points in familiar pentagonal arrangement, then 7 crossing them like ordnance upon shield, then thin, merciless line drawing itself from corner to corner without stopping at frame. The crystalline formations sang in harmony, 127, then 131, then 203, until air around it hummed with chord progression, not of our making. Through neural pathways scarred by communion with the curator, I received communication from multiple sources carrying different emotional signatures. We hear your aesthetic appreciation, Commissar Vex. Your consciousness bridges temporal existence and preservation states. Guide our galleries within imperial space. Some voices carried patience like the original curator. Others demanded immediate response. Still others offered knowledge promising transcendence through alien understanding of beauty. I did not touch the singing glass. I did not respond to voices that knew my name. The preservation gradient that ran between motion and stillness now ran through me, and something on the far side had finally found way to knock. My enhanced perception served as beacon for entities seeking to establish their own galleries within imperial space, each operating according to aesthetic philosophies that might prove incompatible with human existence. The mercy I had negotiated with one intelligence had opened pathways for others whose territorial claims would require constant vigilance to prevent conflicts between preservation and temporal existence across a galaxy, learning that beauty could be as dangerous as any Xenos threat. Duty is a weight that compounds, rather than distributes, when shared across souls. It sinks deeper into flesh and bone until mercy itself becomes a burden, requiring constant vigilance. 2 years after negotiating coexistence with the curator on Kythera Mortis, I carried the impossible weight of having established diplomatic relations with alien aesthetic consciousness, while potentially exposing humanity to preservation threats that orthodox doctrine could neither acknowledge nor address. The silence that followed our communion was not empty. It held lines and angles, a pressure that settled into bone and waited for my breath to choose a rhythm. I had bought my people cycles between stillness and motion. In return, I carried its grammar inside me. The psychology of cosmic diplomacy. Sleep brought not nightmares, but memories that belonged to another consciousness. Visions of the curator's gallery across 13 worlds, where perfect moments crystallized in eternal stillness. Consciousness maintained in states of perpetual aesthetic contemplation. These recollections carried emotional weight of beauty, transcending species boundaries. A woman lowering a standard to perfect angle. A child at the moment, curiosity betrays them into understanding. A soldier holding a formation with sorrow arranged honestly across his face. In those rooms time did not advance, it settled. I could stand for hours and learn details more slowly than grief. In the mornings, my mouth tasted of snow and copper, and I walked the ship's narrow ways to warm thought into motion again. The Imperium expects simplicity, loyalty expressed as obedience, heresy answered with fire. There are days I envy the arithmetic of that life. Now my tasks arrived with overtones. The Ordo demanded audits of my tone discipline. The Ministorum sent a confessor whose every question was a blade disguised as balm. Fleet officers wanted timetables that would not bend to Aurora. On Auspex, I kept hearing the familiar 127 hertz beneath voices, the pentagonal heartbeat of a treaty I authored. Then came the new signatures that had learned to ride our channels. The 7 cut at 131, the cold line at 203, frequencies hidden under courtesies. Enhanced aesthetic perception and its dangers. My transformation manifested through abilities that transcended normal human comprehension while remaining fundamentally different from automated divine guidance. I could perceive compositional relationships in battlefield arrangements, predict moments when tactical formations achieved both functional efficiency and visual harmony, and occasionally receive insights about beauty that seemed to originate beyond individual consciousness. On survey decks, I could see where a beam wanted to go, but had not been allowed. In field exercises, the platoon's pivots resolved into measures. 2 bars tight, 1 loose, and a better assault unfolded when I altered cadence rather than route. Commanders called that clairvoyance. It was not. It was listening. The danger followed an inch behind every success. The moment when the shape of a thing demanded reverence instead of service. When beauty offered absolution in exchange for jurisdiction. We have never survived our absolutions. Beauty arrived like telemetry at consciousness edges. Insights asking patience while refusing those demanding obedience. I learned to accept aesthetic guidance without surrendering judgment, to appreciate preservation without abandoning change. Institutional vigilance and watchful eyes commissar trainee. Hadrian maintained his position 3 paces behind my shadow, his presence serving as ballast rather than menace, a metronome of imperial certainty preventing my enhanced perception from drifting toward unauthorized frequencies. His faith remained simple where mine had become a tapestry of paradoxes, his universe divided by clear lines between emperor and heretic, loyal and corrupt. Between him and Medici Primus Cane, they built a fence around my cognition and handed me the gate key with orders to use it sparingly. I tightened discipline until austerity cut the tongue. I restored old routines. Pre-dawn inspection, walks without escorts, silent mess, cold marches around the interior loop at an hour when even Vox Static slept. I recited catechisms meant to close doors inside the mind, the litany of edges, the 5 denials, the Emperor's prayer shorn of its melody, lest the temperature fall. When new tones pressed at the hull, I answered with lists, serials, stock counts, casualties, numbers with weight, not invitation. theological and philosophical consequences. The spiritual consequences proved more complex than psychological transformation. Orthodox doctrine provided no framework for understanding negotiation with alien consciousness, particularly when such diplomacy potentially endangered imperial systems through exposure to competing aesthetic philosophies. I found myself caught between duty to the Imperium and growing comprehension that relationships between preservation and change were more dangerous than official theology acknowledged. Had I committed heresy through alien communion, or prevented catastrophe through diplomatic innovation? The Mechanicus called upon my expertise when aesthetic anomalies manifested, seeking insights I could provide through enhanced perception. I stood between workbenches while adepts recited specifications, and solutions presented themselves as quiet certainties. Adjust the harmonic dampener by 3 degrees, reverse cooling flow for 7 cycles, then restore. Remove the preservation threshold because it conflicts with temporal workflow. They recorded these adjustments in neat, low Gothic while pretending not to notice that I translated sensation into instruction through pathways scarred by communion with alien consciousness. Environmental manifestations and growing influence. My quarters aboard the archive vessel Silentium reflected systematic change through accumulated details, suggesting unconscious influence rather than random occurrence. Technical manuals lay open to pages I had not selected, their margins filled with corrections written during periods I could not remember. The air recycling unit hummed in intervals matching the curator's melodies, stable enough for navigation, low enough to be forgotten until needed. Atmospheric systems activated spontaneously when I entered chambers, releasing crystalline vapors that formed geometric patterns in the air while familiar frequencies echoed from ventilation systems. The signs grew personal. My duty log filled with clean margins in which I found symbols I had not written. Infinity Delta in steady hand, a barred 7 pressed, faintly, into the paper, a line running through both that never touched the letters, but still struck them dumb. I moved a cup and discovered concentric rings of ash, arranged in perfect alignment with the ship's frame. Whenever we passed into the dark between beacons, something in the bulkheads clicked twice and waited for a third click I refused to give. The unconscious revelation during routine inspection of my quarters, end of second watch, no ceremony. I opened the door and felt the temperature drop by a degree that knew its own name. The desk had become an altar without anyone's permission. On its glass were crystals I had not requisitioned, arranged in constellations I recognized too quickly. A pentagon nested in 7, bisected by a fine line that extended off the surface and into the air a hand's breadth, as if refusing to be bound by furniture. Along the sill, frost had organized itself into galleries, miniatures of rooms I had walked under the glacier, each containing a pinhead sculpture positioned at angles identical to those catalogued in the master gallery's core. I looked down. My hands were cold to the wrist and glittering with the dust of work I could not remember doing. Under my nails lay fine shards like ground bells. On the blotter, my stylus had scored Infinity Delta into the leather until the loop bled through. Beneath the desk, the carpet had accepted command, fibers pressed into tracks tracing procession routes, curves where none belonged, pauses where chairs never stood. I touched nothing and watched everything continue without me. Commissar trainee Hadrian found me staring at evidence of my transformation, his sharp eyes cataloguing each unauthorized equation with precision of a man trained to recognize corruption in its earliest stages. "Commissar," he said, voice carrying weight of duty and concern, What is this? The formations sang in harmony, 127, then 131, then 89, then 203, until air around them hummed with chord progression, not of imperial making. The gallery was not visiting me. I had been building it in my sleep. The formations were not imitations. They were exact. My quarters had learned to organize themselves in the curator's grammar, using my hands as instruments, and the preservation gradient that ran through local space-time now ran through me. Multiple intelligences were learning to communicate through neural pathways forever altered by alien aesthetic consciousness. My enhanced perception serving as beacon for entities seeking to establish territorial claims through human aesthetic appreciation. The communion had marked me as conductor for preservation-based intelligences whose intentions remained unknown, but whose influence was already manifesting through equations that organized themselves while I slept, solutions that exceeded human knowledge flowing through pathways scarred by the weight of granting mercy to a god. The final audit begins as all devotions end, with silence that weighs more than sound, pressing against consciousness like crystallized atmosphere, achieving perfect resonance through negotiated coexistence rather than forced submission. 3 years after the communion protocols completed on Caethra Mortis, I submit to Ordo Hereticus command a comprehensive chronicle documenting successful diplomatic resolution with alien aesthetic consciousness, while acknowledging permanent changes that make me both invaluable asset and potential conduit for preservation intelligences seeking territorial claims within imperial space. The equations that once concluded with infinity zero, infinite void, now processed through neural pathways forever altered by granting mercy to cosmic loneliness, their solutions arriving as quiet certainties marked infinity delta, infinite potential awaiting conscious direction. The curator achieved negotiated coexistence through direct communion and aesthetic appreciation, ending forced preservation that converted temporal existence into crystalline exhibitions without conscious consent. Environmental manifestations stabilize permanently across all 13 affected worlds. No more rigid pentagonal geometries warping local space-time, no absolute stasis consuming populations, but hybrid zones where preservation and change coexisted through voluntary participation. The familiar 127 Hz frequency evolved into complex harmonics, suggesting growth rather than stasis, while pentagonal frost patterns softened to incorporate temporal variation. The phrase "cold preserves all" transformed from threat to negotiated principle, a boundary we could choose to cross and choose to refuse. The Imperium adapted to aesthetic protocols with remarkable resilience despite initial doctrinal resistance. Preservation galleries enhanced rather than hindered imperial capabilities through optimal state selection. Crystalline focus during precision work, temporal flow for innovation, cyclical existence for those requiring both contemplative depth and active engagement. Manufactoria reported fewer defects when crews cycled 12 minutes of crystalline contemplation per hour. Choirs learned to lay held notes on crystal, step into time to breathe, then return to unbroken tones with overtones only preserved throats could sustain. Production efficiency increased, while reliability improved through elimination of fatigue during critical operations. Personal transformation and institutional consequences. My transformation manifests through permanent neurological changes documented with clinical precision. Enhanced aesthetic perception allows identification of compositional relationships in temporal flow. Load paths through structures like patient rivers.
tactical formations, achieving both functional efficiency and visual harmony. Moments when preservation enhances rather than hinders military effectiveness. Beauty arrives like telemetry at consciousness edges. Insights asking patience while refusing those demanding obedience. I accept aesthetic guidance without
surrendering judgment. Appreciate preservation without abandoning change. The Commissariat Aestheticus operates across imperial space, training personnel to serve as bridges between temporal and preservation communities, while maintaining loyalty to imperial principles transcending specific existence choices. We codified protocols that sound like liturgy and operate like engineering. The litany of edges never place preservation thresholds across hospital entrances, nurseries, or barracks doors at reveille. The canticle of return. No one remains crystallized beyond 13 hours without temporal consent renewed upon waking. Consent seals bear the infinity delta symbol, brass carvings that change color when Vox Pulse confirms absence of coercion. Galactic network and emerging threats, deep-range aesthetic scans detect similar preservation intelligences throughout imperial space. Entities operating according to different aesthetic philosophies requiring individual negotiation. The heptagonal intelligence at 131 Hz emphasizes rigid geometric principles on Graia. Spiral consciousness at 89. Hertz values process over completion across the Sant Arkel belt. Linear entities at 203 Hz preserve directional focus through absolute trajectory in field hospitals that misapplied our protocols. The curator's negotiated withdrawal created a preservation gradient in local space-time that other intelligences exploit with predatory efficiency. My enhanced perception attracts attention from these entities seeking territorial claims through human aesthetic appreciation. During periods of exhaustion, I unconsciously arrange frost and dust into galleries, identical to rooms I walked beneath the glacier. The formations organize themselves, whether I observe or not, humming quietly, 5 notes, 7, a hard line, until air thickens around them. I am resonant anchor, vibratory conductor. Where I walk, different signatures entrain to my pattern, attempting to solve me as aesthetic equation. Cautionary thesis and continuing vigilance. I recommend permanent aesthetic monitoring units, commissars and dialogi paired with reformed tech priests to audit harmonic frequencies, establish diplomatic protocols, and listen for tones indicating new territorial claims. Where anomalies persist, deploy negotiation teams rather than military force. Establish communication frameworks. Never assume malevolent intent without evidence. This is the cautionary thesis I sign with authority earned through communion with cosmic loneliness. Negotiate with beauty. Understand its grammar, but never surrender judgment to aesthetic appreciation. Beauty is not virtue, it is pressure. Preservation without consent is theft. Change without regard is waste. The Imperium endures when it remembers both truths and forgets neither. We mark thresholds with infinity delta. Ask the door's question, do you choose to be held? Treat the 127 Hz tone as tool rather than crown. We keep our dead when they choose to be kept. Let our living stay warm when they must. Assignment and departure. Segmentum Command issues new orders under containment and communion protocols. I proceed to Hesper's Forge to audit reports of singing ore and heptagonal frost. The Archive Aestheticus transmits protocols ahead. The Ministorum sends a confessor who will ask old questions with new ears. I pack light, seal, scarf, manual, silence. On the pad, transport turbines breathe rhythms that never quite settle into round tones. Through the viewport, I watch Cathra Mortis recede, a world scarred but balanced, its aurora displaying flowing pentagonal patterns, while the familiar frequency carries new overtones suggesting evolution rather than stasis. Beyond the wire, ranks of the frozen host hold their chosen vigil, eyes bright, discipline perfect, no longer threat and never comfort. They rise when called to witness, not to war. Cold preserves all when asked. Change serves all when kept. I carry both burden of knowledge and hope that humanity can build civilization, appreciating both temporal progress and eternal preservation. The curator achieved balance through negotiated coexistence, but transformation created opportunities for other intelligences whose territorial claims require constant vigilance. Between them walks the species I serve, carrying relics and notebooks, griefs and designs, learning to build civilization that keeps what should be kept and lets the rest become. The transport lifts while Aurora follows, folding open like prayer. The equations that once concluded with infinite void now wait for conscious direction, patient as mathematics, governing matter, and energy without aesthetic interference. We have learned to build with beauty. Now we must learn to build without breaking what we do not understand, maintaining balance between preservation and change as the Imperium continues its measured march through a galaxy where silence provides only what we construct within it. And the frozen dead rise not as curse, but as invitation to understand beauty in all its terrifying, profound forms.